Chapter 12. Maggie heard the doorbell. It raked across her nerves, pulling them right to the surface. She closed her eyes as she prayed for courage and sanity, and anything else she might need to get through this night. The dress was far better than anything else she'd tried on that day. However, it was much shorter than what she was used to wearing. On her way out the door, she tugged the skirt down, trying to get it below her knees. "Stop fidgeting, Maggie," she berated herself. "Stop it." But still, she fidgeted. She couldn't help it. Carefully, she descended the stairs, feeling like it was the night of a prom she'd never gone to. She certainly couldn't have gotten any more nervous had she been in a formal gown with a corsage on her wrist. At the bottom of the steps by the door stood Greg with Inez. When he looked up, he smiled. "Well, hello there." His gaze stayed on her all the way to the bottom. In all of her memory, she couldn't remember anybody ever looking at her like that. "I'd better get back to the kitchen," Inez said, and she removed herself from the situation. Greg surveyed her. "You look beautiful." Once more, she smoothed the skirt down. "Thanks." He offered her his arm. "Shall we?" Keith was midway through pouring Tracy wine when movement at the patio door caught his attention. He looked up, and everything else dropped away. There, on the arm of his best friend, was every dream he'd ever had. The smoky gray dress hugged her curves and set off the mass of waves undulating around her face. "Oh, Greg, you made it!" Dallas greeted them like a 4-star hostess. "And you must be Maggie. Hi, I'm Dallas." "It's nice to meet you." Maggie put out her hand, and Keith had to force the air into his lungs. "Hey, Keith, man." Greg put his hand in the air, and Keith caught it as he had countless times. But never before had his gaze stayed on the beauty standing behind his best friend. "Thanks for asking us. This is Maggie." "Maggie," Keith said, holding out his hand to her like he'd been caught in a trance. "Hi, thanks for asking us." "Our pleasure." Man, she was going to be hard not to watch all night. "Pâté?" Dallas asked, stepping up with a silver serving tray. "Oh, thanks." Maggie took a small piece of bread with a meat spread on it. She took a bite, and Keith had to keep from laughing at the look on her face. "Hi, Greg," Tracy, Dallas's best friend and maid of honor, said as she stepped up. From Keith's recollection, Tracy and Greg had been out about 3 times when they were all in college. If his memory served correctly, Greg's exact assessment was, "Too much drama for me." "Tracy." Greg put his arm around Maggie, apparently to emphasize he had a date, and Keith's fist balled automatically. "This is Maggie Montgomery." "Oh." Tracy spun her wine glass toward her face. "Do you work with Greg at corporate accounting?" No." Maggie hesitated. "She works at the Ayer mansion," Greg said, pulling her closer to his side. "She's the new nanny." "Oh." Tracy dragged the single syllable to 6. "Well, I guess that's about par for the course." She surveyed Greg with smiling condescension. "We all know how you like slumming with the middle class." Had she not been a friend of Dallas, Keith would have shown her the door and thrown her out himself. "Yeah, well," Dallas sighed dramatically, trying to salvage the wreck. "I wonder what's keeping Allison and Jared. They should have been here by now." "Oh," Keith said, wanting only to put his arms around Maggie and get her out of here and away from the snobs he called friends. He hated the defenseless vulnerability on her face. "Jared called and said they were going to be a little late. He got stuck at the office." Dallas sighed again and looked at her watch. "Well, should we wait on dinner then? I told the caterer 7. Keith's concern meter was hitting overload. He wanted to protect Maggie and help Dallas, but he wasn't doing much good at either one. "We can be a little late. It won't kill anyone." Although, as he glanced at Tracy standing smugly to the side, he thought if she popped her mouth off at Maggie again, She might very well not be around to enjoy the duck à l'orange. For her part, Maggie had effectively shrunk to invisible next to Greg. "Oh, where are my manners?" Keith asked, snapping back into host mode. "Would you two like some wine?" He grabbed the bottle and 2 glasses from the serving table. "Sure," Greg said right next to Maggie, and the only thing she could think was that she never should have come. These people were way out of her league. They talked in languages she didn't understand. They ate food that tasted like it had been recycled from the trash can. And most of all, they drank. She wondered at that moment about Keith's night on the town Friday night. Was this just normal protocol with them? Drinks and more drinks. Her gut twisted around that thought. And then he was standing there in front of her with the bottle and the glass, smiling at her with that smile that reminded her so much of a guy she knew. Only that guy wore a beat-up cowboy hat and didn't go around sipping Chardonnay. Her gaze swept past him to the others. Saying it might well banish her from them forever, but the truth was, she would never be invited again anyway. That much was obvious. "I don't drink." Keith's face fell in confusion with the statement, and he looked at her like she had just dropped there from Mars. And his smile fell away as well, too. "What?" Greg asked. Maggie dragged in a breath as her gaze fought to find somewhere to look that wouldn't knife her to death. "I don't drink." She tried to smile to soften the blow as she scratched the side of her head. I hope that's not a problem." Utter silence fell over the whole place. Even the trees stopped rustling. Keith was the first to break the silence. "Of course not. I've got lots of other stuff in the kitchen. Coke, Sprite, water, whatever you want." She had never felt more rescued in her life. "Sprite, if you don't mind." Finally, his smile was back in full. "Of course. I'll be right back." He stepped past her, smelling better than any human had a right to. The whiff of soft musk cologne sent her head swimming, and her gaze followed him all the way to and through the back patio door. Tracy and Dallas were already talking about wedding plans as they took seats on the perfectly positioned outdoor furniture. Greg guided Maggie to the little swing with a metal frame that rounded up and over the top. It was on the same patio, but far enough away they could have a modicum of privacy. On the swing, he leaned toward her. "I'm really sorry about that. Tracy and I, well, we were together for a while. She can be like that sometimes." "Don't worry about it," Maggie said, trying to take her own advice. She reached over and put her hand on his knee for emphasis. "It comes with the territory." Keith stepped back into the yard and walked right over to her. "Here you are." He produced a wine glass with clear, bubbly liquid. "Enjoy." Her heart skipped through her chest. Somehow she had expected a green plastic bottle to announce to everyone how different she was. Instead, the wine glass said she fit, with no question. "Thanks." The wink was almost non-existent, but she saw it just the same. "No problem." Throughout drinks and dinner, Keith watched her. There was no doubt that this was not her element, and yet, she held her own. Allison, thankfully, was much less of a snob than Tracy, and between her and Dallas, they made sure Maggie was included as much as possible. "Nice party," Greg said, sliding up by Keith, who stood at the entertainment center talking with Jared. "Thanks." Jared excused himself and walked off. "She's something, huh?" Greg asked, indicating Maggie, who sat across the room with the women. She wasn't in the conversation, but the light that permeated her every move was right there with her. "Yeah, something. I wonder if she's, seeing anyone." The thought had never occurred to Keith. "I don't know. She came with you, didn't she?" "Yeah." Greg took a drink. "But you know my track record with women. They're always attached to someone else." The knife went right through Keith's heart. "Yeah? Well, maybe this time you'll get lucky." Greg tipped the glass up. "Here's hoping." "Thanks for coming. It was fun." Dallas stood at the top step of the guest house, Keith at her side, as Greg and Maggie stood on the porch saying their goodbyes. "Thanks for asking us. We had a good time," Greg said. "Yeah, it was wonderful," Maggie said, fighting with everything in her not to look at Keith. It was nearly impossible, but looking at him standing there with his arm around Dallas was going to kill her. "Good night," Greg said, and turned her toward the cars. "Night," Dallas called happily. Maggie would be happy too if she was going back in with Keith. The guests were gone, the party over. Now they could be alone. That thought hit her hard. It was clear Dallas was staying there. Of course Maggie wasn't naive enough to think that nothing was happening when they were alone. She closed her eyes to block out that thought. Then, just at the end of the steps, Greg swayed into her. She looked at him with concern. "Are you okay to drive?" "Yeah, I didn't have that much." Maggie glanced back at the guest house, but Dallas and Keith had already gone in. She looked back at Greg, and her mind went through the evening. 2 wines on the patio, a couple during dinner, 1 or 2 more after. With a breath, she watched him walking to the car. It was barely there, but still it was. "Maybe I should drive." Greg laughed. "We're just going to the mansion." "No, I mean, maybe I should drive you home." "Home?" He jerked backward to look at her. "I'm fine. I barely had anything." She put her arms around herself and glanced back at the house. "Yeah, well, I'd feel better if we all got home in one piece." He snorted. "If you drive me home, how are you going to get home?" There was money in her purse now. Sure, there were other things she could get, but none were more important than this. "I'll take a cab. It's no big deal." Greg looked at his watch. "But it's after 10. You won't get back here until, like, midnight." "Yeah, thus we'd better get going." She walked around the car to him. "Keys." He was obviously not ready for this confrontation, and he hesitated. However, Maggie wasn't taking no for an answer. Finally, he relinquished the keys. As he walked to the other side, she laughed. "But don't go to sleep on me. I'm going to need some directions." "That was great," Dallas said as they picked up the debris from the party. "Yeah, except Tracy's stupid comment to Maggie." Dallas waved that off. "Oh, you know how Tracy is. She talks before she thinks." Something inside of Keith lodged at the comment. He wanted to say more, but what more was there to say? "I think your friends are inconsiderate snobs?" That was honest, but not very prudent. "Oh, but didn't Greg and Maggie make the cutest couple?" Dallas cooed. "I told you he's got a thing for her. I could tell by how he looked at her. You mark my words, those two are going to get together." Worse words had never been spoken. At the front window, Keith pulled the curtain back and peered out into the darkness. They were gone, presumably to the mansion, or would Greg take her back to his place first? That was not an encouraging thought. Keith shook his head. Surely not. That was all the way back into Houston. The timing alone precluded that. Still, he couldn't help but think even if they didn't tonight, if Greg pursued this, it wouldn't be long. That's just the way things worked in their crowd. "So, Mr. Ayer," Dallas said, wrapping her arms around him from behind before he knew she was there. "What do you say I give you a little preview of June 3rd? She sidled her way around him and leaned on the windowsill. Softly, she reached up and kissed him. There was no doubt she was beautiful. There was no doubt any other man alive would have wanted her. But the sad fact was, there was also no doubt that the one woman he really wanted had just left with his best friend. That was the way things were, and although it might kill him, it was time he accepted it. "Here?" Maggie asked, turning cautiously into the driveway. "Yeah, apartment 215 at the end there." She nodded. "Just park under the awning." Again she nodded, guiding the little sports car into a space and with a sigh of relief, turning it off. The light from the headlights slashed through the night and died. They were left under the amber nightlight above. "Thanks for bringing me home," Greg said, putting his gaze to the floorboard. "You really didn't have to do that." "Yeah, well, I'd rather know you're home safe and sound than to worry about if you'd become highway pizza on the way home." She fought to make her voice light and cheerful. The night had been nice. Greg was a nice date. And overall, she knew it was a night she would remember. "You can come up," he said, glancing past her to the apartments beyond. She glanced the direction he indicated. "Oh, no, I'd better get home." "Well, you can at least come up and call the cab." That hurdle hadn't crossed her mind, but he had a point. "Okay." Nerves like she'd never had before snaked through her as they got out of the car. He started up the stairs first, and she followed. At the top, he opened the door and flipped on the light. She followed him in, her gaze taking in every detail of the room. Clean and neat, just like him. At the kitchen counter, he grabbed a phone book and paged through it. "You got any one you like in particular?" She shrugged. "It doesn't matter." After a minute more of searching, Greg reached for the phone, dialed the number, and placed the call. When the cab was on its way, he turned to her. "Would you like something to drink? I don't have much. Water, milk, beer?" She scrunched her nose and shook her head. "No, thanks." Greg nodded, and Maggie was pretty sure he already knew what her answer would be when he asked. He walked over to where she was standing, looking like each step might be his last. "I had fun tonight, just so you know." Her smile was genuine. "So did I." His gaze dropped between them. "Really? I mean, I really felt bad about Tracy and her being so rude to you." "No, hey, don't worry about it. I lived. It's okay." When he looked at her, Maggie's gaze was swept up in his. Between them, his fingers brushed hers, and before she knew it, he leaned toward her. It wasn't what she'd expected. Why, she didn't know, but somehow him being a nice guy who would call a cab with no pressure and then kiss her before she left wasn't where she thought this night would go. His lips brushed hers, but only that. It was nicer than she thought it would be. Her eyes came open, and she looked up to find him gazing right through her. "Can I call you sometime?" Her heart had no other answer. "I'd like that." The cab ride back was eternal, and Maggie had to fight not to fall asleep the whole way. Once at the estate, she paid the driver more than she had thought it would be, and then slipped from the cab and around to the back. Quietly, she let herself in the kitchen door. Inez had carefully gotten her the message that she would leave it open. Up the stairs and to her bedroom door she went, but when she was there, she couldn't just go in without checking. Softly, she slipped to Izzy's door and opened it. The child in the baby bed was barely visible, yet she looked older than Maggie remembered. "Good night, little one." Then across the hall to Peter's room. He was curled in a ball, his thumb in his mouth. A question went through Maggie's mind at his posture, but then she thought rationally she'd never actually seen him in the middle of the night before. Softly, she kissed her fingers. "Good night, sweet prince. I love you." And she tiptoed out. 5.5 hours later, Maggie was up again. Over and over she stifled the yawns, but she was determined not to let her one day off hurt her job performance. It was back to lessons and lunches, and although the night before had been a nice distraction, this was life. The day slipped by almost without notice. She was so in tune with the schedule, it was like it had never been a problem. Even Patty Ann almost smiled when they were down at the dining room door at 5:45, cleaned, pressed, and ready. Dinner went well, although Mr. Ayer was not present. Maggie considered asking about that, but she didn't have the courage. Mrs. Ayer mostly ate in silence, and although Maggie wanted to say something to her, she couldn't think what that something should be. When dinner was finished, Maggie had Peter kiss his mother, and they went upstairs to take baths. Isabella went through first, and her new favorite word seemed to be geeky. It was cute to hear her say it over and over, but Maggie was afraid the others would throw a fit if they heard, So in her best interest, she knelt by the tub, washing off the slick little body. Say, Mommy. Yeah, Mommy. She held her lips just right on the M part of Mommy to demonstrate the letter. Mommy. Kiki, Isabella squealed excitedly. No, Maggie laughed. Mommy. Mommy. Kiki. Well, I guess Mommy is going to have to wait till tomorrow. She grabbed a towel and dried the first little one off. Okay, Mister, your turn. Like the trooper he was, Peter stepped forward. Maggie took hold of his shirt and pulled it up. His pants were halfway down when she noticed the dark brown circles on the back of his arm. Peter, what happened? Concern drained through her as she gazed at him. Did you fall? Slowly, side to side, his head moved, but his gaze was on the tile. What? Maggie turned him to the other side, and there were identical marks on his other arm. Gently, she turned him to face her. Peter, who did this to you? He wouldn't look at her. You can tell me. I won't be mad. Maggie's mind was flying through every bit of training she'd ever had on how to get a child to tell you something they didn't want to tell you.
Izzy cried,
Peter said softly.
I tried to tell her to stop.
Izzy? Maggie's gaze went to the baby playing with a towel on the floor. She surveyed the child in one glance. Was she hurt?
No. She got in trouble. I tried to tell her to stop.
What did she get into trouble for? Every point in Maggie's body was in full defense and concern mode. Peter didn't say anything, and Maggie realized the intensity of her voice was scaring him. She forced herself to calm down and breathe. It's okay, Peter. Really. You can tell me.
She was trying to climb the ladder on the playhouse.
The words came slow and deliberately.
Miss Haga got mad.
It was all she could do to keep her emotions from reaching the surface. Did she hit Izzy? Peter's head moved back and forth. Did she hit you? Again, his head moved back and forth. Peter, this is important. Did Miss Haga hurt you? His head stopped, and he stood there staring at the tiles. Maggie's heart had ceased beating. It's okay, Peter. I won't get mad. I promise.
She wanted me to be quiet because I was telling Izzy to stop crying.
Maggie's intensity felt like it might overwhelm her. Still, she forced herself to calm down so she could put her hand gently on his back without scaring him. Peter, did she hurt you? When he looked at her, there were tears welling in his brown eyes.
She shook me real hard. I told her I was sorry, but she was really mad. I tried to tell her.
Oh, baby boy. And Maggie pulled him into her arms, wishing she had never heard of such a thing as a day off.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.